thanks for allowing me to do this with you. I got the easy job because I just get to ask the questions. Jason has to defend all the stuff he said. And boy, has he said some tough stuff. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see the book. I just finished it. I worked hard this week to read it. I'm a slow reader. And Jason has a very big vocabulary, so it really is fascinating vocabulary he's got. I had to make sure that I had my phone out all the time. As was mentioned, I'm at Wire Points, and my partner right over here, is that aqua green shirt? Mark Lemon. So Mark and I partnered starting about 4 years ago. Mark had this Wire Points going beforehand, but we partnered together about 4 years ago. And just as a quick, so you know who's speaking here. And at Wire Points we do research, policy, and commentary on what's happening in Illinois. And our focus has been primarily on financials, but as we know in the last couple of years, nobody cares about finances anymore. It's all existential issues, right? Seriously, right? It's all about mandates and your kids. Can your kids go to school? Can we go to work? Who can work? Who's essential? Who's not? So it's been really tough stuff. So Mark made a great decision at one point. We said we got to get into this COVID stuff because they're not telling the truth about a lot of things. And so we're a data-centric group. We love data, which makes this discussion interesting because it's much more a lot of philosophy. But that's what we're trying to do. And our ultimate goal at Wire Points is we want to see Illinois be the state that it should be, which is a thriving, growing state where people are moving here, people are staying here, companies are coming in. And I say that, it sounds kind of funny right now because everybody's leaving and we have the opposite going on. But my mother's here in the crowd. My mother came from Ecuador. My mother came from Ecuador, I guess right around 1960. My father came from Poland before that. And Illinois and Chicago, this was the beacon of opportunity. This were the people came from all over the world. And now it's the opposite. So Mark and I work hard to try to eventually help, be part of helping turn that around. Now, moving over to Jason here, we share a lot in common because I love the American dream, and the American, only because I got to see it with my parents, and I got to live in Ecuador for a few years. I got to live in Poland for a few years. I've had this just awesome ability to see what my parents were able to do coming here and surviving and all the difficulties of immigrants. This is the American dream. And right next to me is another person who talks a lot about the American dream, and he loves America, and he's been passionate about it. So there you go. Jason from Jamaica came when you were about 20, is that right? Has a PhD in philosophy from that was Purdue, that's right. I'm going to let you describe a little bit more because I'm asked. The context of Jason matters in this whole discussion, so it's not going to do me any good to say the 5 books he's written and the tons of work he's done. It's been fascinating. But Jason has taken on a stance. I tell you, when I started reading this book, and this is going to be the way to start, I said, wow, you take on some really tough topics. First, it says that in some form, and this is Jason's book, that in some form Africans actually made themselves into slaves. Wow. I was like, wow. Then I had to keep reading to figure out how he's going to defend that. Then he says reparations have already been paid. And I was like, whoa. So I'm excited to hear. Of course, I got to read the book and read the defense. But I think it's a really well put together book. What do white Americans owe black people? That's the question. So I think before we get started, last comment I want to make, I have a good friend who he's center-rightish probably, but he doesn't read a lot of stuff. He reads the Chicago Tribune every day, and then he watches the local news. And so when I talk about this CRT, and when I remember Beth and I working on and looking at this Evanston situation, and they had done a study of the Evanston schools, and the analysis they'd done in the first 3 paragraphs, they said that white supremacy was at the core of what was happening in the province of Evanston. And it's like, wow, white supremacy. So, my friend doesn't see that stuff because it doesn't get reported. So he thinks, well, you guys are just making a lot of big deal about, what's a big deal? Let's talk about race in the schools. It's not a big deal. Come on. that's, I think, the world we're in. And Jason, you're coming at it from the other side. You're trying to wake people up. So with that, tell us about your book, why you wrote this book, and kind of help people that are in the center. Maybe most people here are already in line with a lot of what you say. But I think there's a lot of people that don't get to hear what you say. So please tell us about your book, what motivated you, and from there.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you so much, Carrie, for putting this on, organizing this amazing event. And a special thanks to Beth Feely, who introduced me to Carrie, without whom this event would not have happened. And thank you all for coming. It's amazing to see the panoply of people here, and I'm very thrilled to have met some of you tonight, personally. My last book was called We Have Overcome, an Immigrant's Letter to the American People. And it was a love letter to the American people. I wanted to fight what I thought was the Americophobia that I found afflicting and infecting this country. And as an immigrant who came here at 20 and who wanted to be here, who wanted to be an American from as far back as he could remember himself, which was about the age of 3, I said something really, really has to be done. That I cannot stand and watch the great unprecedented republic that we are privileged to live in. Those of you who are born here through an accident of birth, lucky you. Fortunately, I became a naturalized citizen in 2002. But I wanted to do something to play some small role in inoculating Americans against the idea pathogens that I thought were infecting this country, what I call Americophobia. And so it was a love letter to the American people. It was dedicated to the American people. And it was also, in some sense, recounting my journey as an immigrant of 20, coming here with $120 in my pocket, and the story of other immigrants whom I met along the way when I was in college, when I was working up to 45 hours a week to put myself through school before I won a scholarship to do my PhD. And I wanted to tell their stories, that in America, the American dream is a constitutive fabric and a part of the American dream. If you spit on the American dream, as people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and these woke idiots do, then you're spitting in a constitutive part of the American identity. So I wanted to write a follow-up book to sort of take on what I call the aggrievement industry in this country. And by the aggrievement industry, I really mean, in some sense, those people who think that they have an entitlement or that they are entitled to something other than the products of their own labor. Because I think that what we owe each other is respect of our inalienable, inviolate individual rights. We owe each other courtesy, and we have a moral duty, I would think, to affirm the dignity of other people. But the idea somehow that because of one's skin color and because of past atrocities, America was born with a terrible birth defect, slavery, that one can ostensibly point to certain disparities and incongruences and asymmetries between the races and causally link all of those phenomena to something like slavery. I wanted to do the hard work of showing that, first of all, reparations have been already paid. And I do, I think, a quite remarkable job, if I may say so myself. This is an incentive for you all to buy the book. For those of you who haven't received your free copy, I think I do a good job of showing the reparative moments in this country that have taken place, beginning with 1776. The 1776 and the Declaration of Independence forged the crucibles in which Black freedom was established. And then the second founding of America, which I talk about in the book, the Civil War, in which hundreds and thousands of people died to free slaves. And in the third iteration, the third great founding of this country, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which brought into the domain of the ethical, which brought into the pantheon of the human community, where every Black person now became a unit of ethical concern. And the subsequent affirmative action programs following the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1972 Employment Act, I should say, the establishment of Black Studies programs on campuses that I won't give, if I say too much, then you'll be disincentivized by the book, right? So this is why I wanted to write the book, to take on the idea that every single asymmetry, every single disparity that exists between or among races in this country are causally the responsibility of something called slavery. I wanted to show ostensibly that this is not the case, that there are other phenomena that we can point to which cause these disparities. I also wanted to show that there is something quite poisonous going on in cancel culture, in what I call woke supremacy, and in critical race theory that is very, very divisive. I came to America and I lived in the Deep South, and I saw amazing race relations improve over the years, and I've seen a divisive narrative adopted by what I call black nihilists, who make a profound argument that black emancipation rests on something like the abolition of the white race, or they don't. Some of them are a little bit more astute or euphemistic, one should rather say, in their terminologies, the abolishment of something called whiteness. And so I wanted to also end on a hopeful note, which I do in the book, that we can look forward to the day when we have what I call a transracial society. I'm sort of poking a little bit at the trans people here. But that we can have a transracial society, a cosmopolitan brotherhood where all persons, regardless of race, realize that we're all Americans, and our American identity is forged in the crucibles of these common core principles that we hold together. And these unite us as Americans. That's the main, but if in one phrase, it would be to take on the aggrievement industry. The aggrievement complex industry, or industry complex.
All right. Why don't we start then with that first claim you make right off the start. I'd never seen the argument that you make, and I'll let you make it because I don't want to botch it. But of course, the Europeans were trying to expand in the world, right? They were looking for more, right? And when they come to Africa, they see a culture that you use the word animists or animism, and basically these were people who were living with the land, and they didn't distinguish between living and non-living or everything. I don't know the right way to say this, but they valued everything, right? They're part of nature. And it's that difference that made all the difference in what happens going forward. Why don't you explain that better than I just did, obviously. Why is it you say that the slaves themselves were responsible?
Well, I'm a bit of a provocateur, for those of you who don't know me, but the title is meant to be provocative, how the African made himself into a slave, deliberately. But I think I spent 50 pages outlining what I meant and what I still mean by that. Well, apart from the role that Africans themselves and Arabs played in the slave trade, Skip Gates from Harvard University, Henry Louis Gates, actually admitted reluctantly that 90% of the slave trade was facilitated by Africans themselves who kidnapped other Africans and sold them for tawdry costume jewelry that not even peasants in Europe would be caught wearing, and kidnapped. There was no sense of kinship among these Africans. There were different warring tribes and facilitated the slave trade. So ostensibly, one can just say, who is to blame? Well, blame can be spread around because had the Africans themselves not facilitated the slave trade through cooperative efforts. We have this idea of Europeans landing on the shores of Africa and sort of randomly kidnapping people, and the story is much more complicated than that. So I wanted to tell that part of the story as the precursor to answering the question, what do white people owe black people? Well, if there are going to be reparations, there should be reparations from Nigeria, Kenya, and all of sub-Saharan Africa. Most of those countries participated in the slave trade. You see how ludicrous this argument would be, right? So that's the first part. The second part, the more contentious part, has to do with the fact that every nation, I argue, needs a manifest destiny, needs a telos, needs an endpoint as to what is the purpose of my foreign policy, what is the purpose of my nation, what is the moral meaning of my nation. And I argue that the European countries, even tiny Portugal, had the audacity to colonize parts of Africa because they had a manifest destiny. They were on a mission to bring what they thought was civilization, enlightenment, but also a rapacious appetite to benefit financially from these countries. But when you do not abstract yourself from nature, when you see yourself as being part of nature, when you adopt a philosophy of animism, that is, you're not abstracting yourself from the earth and seeing the creatures around you as separate from yourself, I argue in the book that you become indistinguishable from nature. And those cultures that have distinguished themselves from nature, that have adopted the Judeo-Christian ethos and said, there is this person, myself, and then there is nature. And nature is something that's meant to be conquered, exploited, and what one does is not adapt oneself to nature as do animals, but one adapts, one allows one's desires to accommodate, one allows nature to accommodate itself to one's desires. So we don't adapt ourselves to nature. When there's a hurricane, when there's a drought, animals starve. When there's a drought, human beings build dams. When there is a lot of heat, animals die from the heat. What do human beings do? We build air conditioning units, right? So we learn to adapt not ourselves to nature, but adapt nature to suit our needs. And when the Europeans came upon the Africans, what they found were individuals who had not abstracted themselves from nature, but saw themselves as inseparable from nature, and therefore they did not have a manifest destiny. Therefore, they were very conquerable by their own, what I call their own cosmology, or cosmogony, to use a big word. So, if you don't abstract yourself from nature, if you see yourself as being tethered to nature, you're not going to develop the political philosophy, you're certainly not going to develop the technology that you need to defend yourself against a rapacious adversary or enemy who's coming in to conquer you, because you are indistinguishable from nature. You don the clothing of the animals, you identify with the earth, you identify with the earth to such an extent that to extract yourself or abstract yourself from it would be unthinkable. And the Europeans had a different identity. Nature was something to be rapaciously exploited and to build civilizations out of. And so they saw the Africans as indistinguishable from water buffalo, from deer, from zebras. They were just things to be conquered and domesticated. And that's what I mean by sort of Africans turning themselves into slaves, by the absence of a manifest destiny, by the absence of an ability to abstract oneself from nature and to use nature in such an exploitative way. The Europeans then had the upper hand. And the same thing with the Native Americans, I think, when the Europeans and then later on the Americans won the war for resources in this country.
So this is a new book, and I don't know if you've made this argument in the past, what kind of pushback, what's going to be the pushback you're going to get from people on this? You know, how much pushback are you going to get, and is it, I guess, what's your defense? And I know you write it in the book about it, but how do you defend it as well as you can?
Well, I'm not very concerned about pushback. What I'm concerned about is the truth, and telling the truth. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which I would sort of defend myself is by saying, look, all human beings are possessed of intrinsic dignity and inviolate moral worth, but not all cultures are equal. We're not the moral equivalent of, no disrespect to anyone here who happens to be Iranian or Saudi Arabian, but our government is not the moral equivalent of the Saudi Arabian government, not the people themselves, but the government. Our culture is not the moral equivalent or the political equivalent of North Korea. And technologically speaking, there are cultures that are much more advanced than other cultures. So I would simply say, and also politically speaking, I think countries that have a constitutional republic such as ours are much more superior than our countries that are ruled by despotism or authoritarianism, that don't respect the inalienable rights of individuals. So I will simply point to the historical record. I would say, look, if you doubt my point, look at history. Look at those civilizations that didn't develop technologically without being sentimental about it, from a sort of dispassionate, detached anthropological point of view, one can simply ostensibly point to those civilizations that did not have the means to defend themselves and were overrun and overtaken by superior civilizations. If anyone doubts that, I would say go to the Amazon today, non-inoculated against certain diseases, put your foot into the first river that you find barefooted, and come back and tell me if you've survived. Well, you won't survive. And the reason you won't survive is because of, largely in part, because of the superiority of Western medicine. So I think the historical record is there, and I use that as my defense.
Okay, so if we move from there, right, this happened, we know it happened. We know that the slave trade happened, the history we all know. So then you move from there to make your next bullet point, which is that reparations have largely happened. And you explain in the various ways that's happened. So I think that's the next big question there. That's, again, we know this is a big deal. As we know, in Evanston, we've started reparations recently to a small extent, and it's argued as whether they're reparations or not. We know we've got things like basic income starting, which is not a reparation, but we might think of that depending on who's getting the money. So it's a big deal that you're coming in with an argument that it's already happening or already happened to a certain extent. So please take us through that.
Well, I'll take you through part of it, not all of it, because again, if I take you through all of it, then it's like giving away the plot of a movie. You're not going to watch the movie if I tell you what the movie is about. So just to highlight, really, is something on the order of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a momentous act. It was a remarkable achievement in the sense that it rightfully corrected a wrong that had been committed. It brought blacks within the domain of the ethical. It made them, there were no longer any punitive laws based solely on the basis of race that could punish blacks because they were blacks, as we had under Jim Crow, as we certainly had under slavery. But I go further and call the 1964 Civil Rights Act a moral eugenics program, in the sense that I think it was a proper violation of property rights. What I mean by that is it made racism illegal. It said to a restaurant owner or a business owner, you cannot use your private property as an extension of your living room. Now, some people are going to disagree with me in the book on that. They're going to say the 1964 Civil Rights Act was an egregious violation of individual property rights. And I say yes. And given the collusion between the state against blacks, given the fact that the state had played an enormous role since the inception of this country in producing racists, given the fact that black people's taxes were appropriated and used to finance everything from the California railroad systems to the gold rush, from which blacks were excluded, to, in the Deep South, everything from government-issued contracts to privately owned white companies to patents and so on and so forth, at the expense of blacks. Rights are contextual. I'm a First Amendment absolutist, but I realize, of course, that the First Amendment is not an absolute, because you cannot commit false advertising, you cannot commit slander, you can't shout fire in a theater. So we have to look at the context in which these people had been using their property backed by the government for centuries, and it was used to keep blacks outside the domain of the ethical. So I think the 1964 Civil Rights Act, for me, was the greatest reparative moment in the history of this country, because it not only it did two things. It brought blacks within the domain of the ethical and granted them full equality before the law. And it also said to white people, you can't be racist. You can have freedom of conscience, you can be a racist in your conscience, but if you try to manifest that in the real world and discriminate against a black person, that person has a legal right to sue you, and you're breaking the law. Now, short of a bloated totalitarian state, I really don't know how much farther a state can go in transgressing on the rights of individuals. So when we talk about inequalities and inequities, a lot of what qualifies as candidates for reparations, I would say, belong in courts of law. If you're discriminated today, or if you can ostensibly point to ways in which your property was, if you can point to ways in which your property was illegally confiscated, as have been cases in the South, then reparations are due to you. But most of the reparations claims are made on two foundational axes. One is there are white people today who enjoy a particular type of white privilege because they are white, and because of that kind of privilege, which translates into disparities, they must be punished. Now, if that principle were turned on black people in the reverse, or inversely one should say, you could see how ghastly that would be. And the second is that something on the order of ancestral guilt. That is, your ancestors owned slaves, which putatively is quite false, because the majority of white people living in the country today, their ancestors actually came after the Civil War. And if they didn't, so what? What does that have to do with any person living today? There are no persons who are black who are slaves today, and there are no persons who are white who are slave owners today. So the principle that secures it is a very, very shaky one.
All right, I know you spend a good bit of time, not just in the book, but outside of your outside work, and where you get attacked quite a bit is on wokeism and a lot of the CRT and cancel culture. So I want to bring up an example of something that was brought to my attention recently at New Trier, the high school here. And I'll use it as an example, and please tie that into your book. So in a 9th grade English class, there were a few slides that were given to students, and one of them had a page. It's pretty fascinating. And again, this kind of comes back to that mention I had about, how bad is this? Is it just a discussion on race, or is it more than that? So in here, there's a page, and it's got a big word on the top that says privilege. And the kids were asked to look at the page and circle those things that gave them privilege. I'm going to take off my glasses so I can see. It says this will not be shared with anybody, but only the teacher can see it. Okay. So here's under privilege. Parents are married. Parents are heterosexual. You circle these things, and this is how you know you're privileged. Circle heterosexual, white, male, no learning disability, cisgender, you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. If you are a middle or owning class people, if you're Christian, if you have no physical disability, and you're English speaking. So this was something where my understanding from the parent who sent it to me was the child that got it felt really weird, because the context in which he or she received it was, gosh, if I'm white, it doesn't really matter what I do. I just, I get it no matter what, so it doesn't matter what I do. I should feel guilty about it. And for the people that weren't privileged, well, it doesn't matter what they do, because they're not going to succeed anyway. And it was just a really funny feeling the kid had. Now again, was this kid more sensitive? I don't know. But this is the kind of stuff, and there's another example that I have here, where in a presentation that was made, that was on, I guess it was a Zoom presentation. Again, they talked about separating the students. Well, not separating the students, that's not true. They have affinity groups. And these affinity groups, allow students to come together, they call them marginalized identities, to gather, talk in a safe space about issues related to that identity. And again, there's nothing wrong with that per se. The question is it being promoted and pushed? And so you got different groups. One is the, I don't know what the NF stands for, but it's a Black and Brown group, and Asian American Pacific Islander, a Black Student Alliance, Latinx, Mixed Race, Muslim Student Association, Young Asians with Power, and the one that really got me was White Anti-Racist, which means that, I don't know, you can't have a white group, or if you're not in the White Anti-Racist group, that means you're a racist, I guess. I'm not sure. And that bothered me, but these are the kind of things we're seeing in schools. A lot of people say it's not CRT, and I personally don't want to get into the definitions of CRT. I want to know what's being taught to our kids and what are they being pushed towards. But these are the kind of things that we're seeing in a very high-end school that's typically had fantastic results, and the teachers are super smart and super engaged. And when I meet them, I'm always impressed with them. But there's a different agenda going on. Can you please tie this into what you're seeing in what you've written about in your book and how to oppose that?
Well, as my friend Mike Schreck said one time, what we talk about, we used to have a radio show together in, Mike's at the back in the glasses. When we talk about white privilege, Mike said, when we talk about privilege, we should talk about just being blessed. Look, there's something called cosmic injustice, and there's something called cosmic justice. Not all of us are equally beautiful. Not all of us are equally intelligent. Not all of us have the same kind of athletic prowess. I'm not the athletic equal of my countryman Usain Bolt. And I'm sure that my friend Beth Feely's son, Will, would put me to shame, and I'm probably 40-something years older than he is, put me to shame on a tennis court. So this whole idea of privilege is a political playing at deuces wild at best, and at worst, sort of conmanship sports to gain nothing but raw, naked power over people. And I mean this quite seriously. So in the book, I do talk about the fact that, I don't know if I talked about it in the book, but there's something called height privilege. I know I've walked into a restaurant with somebody, a male who's maybe white, 6'4", or a woman who's blonde hair, blue-eyed, and has great cleavage. I can say this in this audience: great cleavage, and blessed with all kinds of attributes, and she's going to get served in a room before I do, because I'm just this ordinary guy, right? And I saw this in Atlanta, actually, when I had a car and I was going to get it serviced, and about 55 men were lined up. This is back in the day when you used to line up to get your oil change. And along walks this white woman, southern blonde with a lame top, cleavage, all the cleavage out, stilettos that could hurt the pavement. And she walks up to the front and she says, she looks back and she says, "Y'all are suckers." And she said, and she gets serviced. Now, she obviously has beauty privilege, among others. Now, I'm sort of being facetious here, right? But the fact is that, what the hell do we expect people to do about their privileges? So long as you're not eviscerating the dignity of other people. So, yeah, white people have certain privileges. I have educational privileges. I have 5 college degrees. If you count my associates, I have 5 college degrees, including a PhD. I have educational privilege, right? I've taught kids 90% of whom were in the Ku Klux Klan in Southern Illinois. And I didn't feel like I was victimized by any one of them, because I told them, I said, any one of you little suckers that mess with me, I have the legal resources, I have the linguistic capabilities, I have the financial means, I have the cultural capital, I will put you in your place, I will call the cops on you, and you are gonna get thrown out of my class. I'm the daddy here. I'm the powerful one here. I've got the power, right? So this notion of white privilege is very, very complicated. I'm not sure that sitting here, Ted, a black man with 5 PhDs, I wish, 5 college degrees, pretty upper middle class, I think I have a good brain, God bless me with a good brain, that that somebody in Appalachia who is without teeth, who's white, who's living in a trailer park, who has no health, access to clean water, no health, no resources, that person is more privileged than I am? I don't know. I think it's very complicated. So to unilaterally apply this notion of white privilege as if it's a metric that can fit and be applied universally to all white persons, regardless of class, background, is very, very problematic. And that's what I wanted to bring home in the book. When it's used in the way that it's used as the bargaining chip for power, and nothing more than power.
Something that caught my attention in the book was a line, and it's a very short quote. It was 4 words: "Black culture is dead." And I wanted to expand on that, because it's you say it can come around. Would you explain that, please?
Well, this country would not be the country it is without black people. Let me just say that, first of all. Black Americans and black immigrants, among other immigrant groups, but I'm speaking particularly of black Americans, are a constitutive part of this country's identity. And they have had a thriving, amazing culture that has made enormous contributions to, I don't use the word American culture, American civilization, in every sphere, from medicine to entrepreneurship. When I say black culture is dead, what I mean is that the dominant narrative, the dominant cultural trends emanating from those who take themselves to be spokespersons of black culture is bankrupt. That is, it's dead in the sense that an increasing amount of black people are buying into the entitlement, the victimology narrative that you did not find when blacks were truly, truly oppressed and victimized, like under segregation, under Jim Crow, in the periods after emancipation, when there were vicious, evil miscegenation laws that prohibited, I think one of the most evil, speaking my partners here, Martin, and he happens to be white, I think one of the most evil things that you can do is prevent two people who love each other from marrying each other because of race. So when there was something called miscegenation laws in this country and blacks were really, really oppressed, Bob Woodson has a quote, help me out here, Beth, if I miss, that when we were at, or
when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best.
and it's not meant to glamorize an oppressive past. It's just meant that when you were truly oppressed, you had to find every single resource in your body and your soul to transcend that oppression. And so when I say the culture is dead, I don't mean it unilaterally, like, there are no individual blacks making amazing contributions to American civilization. But I mean that the dominant narrative that is coming out of the school of Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Michelle Alexander Jones and what's that other freak, Nicole Hannah Jones. What's her name? Robin. Oh. Yeah. And she's speaking for all black people too. She's not even black. That too many people are falling prey to this kind of victimology narrative. And it's having a deadening, flatlining effect on a lot of black children. And you see this in the classroom. I've been a professor of 25 years now. I see it even in the college level where my black kids, I'm 56, so I can call them my kids, are afraid of seeming like brainiacs, because to be brainy and articulate and have a facility with the language and to be fluent and to be smart is to be seen as acting white. That is a horrific philosophy that is coming from the black far left. It's not white people who are devising these narratives. It's coming out of our public school system, really, and from these teachers and from blacks themselves who have adopted, unfortunately, a philosophy that says if I'm successful, if I'm excellent, and the only way, if you want to fight white privilege, there's only one way to do it, and I call it black excellence. Be the best that you can be and be even better than everybody else at what you do, and then you're untouchable. But the idea somehow that the culture is dead really is traceable back to this idea that a large percentage is falling victim to this philosophy. And also the fact that, look, if people want to have children out of wedlock, that's their business. But the fact that 74% of African American children are born out of wedlock, and that at least 72% of that is causally linked to poverty, crime, and a host of other maladies, is a pathology that I think has to be reckoned with, and I reckon with it quite deeply in the book. So that's what I mean by that statement.
Yeah, I want to bring up something that Mark and I have been doing some research on education, and just about whatever it was 4 weeks ago, I went down to Decatur. We were looking at statistics of the Chicago public schools, and some of you may have seen the piece we wrote where we looked at, we saw the Chicago public schools celebrating that they had an 84% graduation rate. And we looked at that and said, wait a minute, we had been in the Illinois report card, which is the State Board of Education. They publish all the numbers for all the school districts in Illinois. And we had seen just before that only 26% of juniors could read at grade level on the SAT. And we said, wait a minute, so what's that? So we wrote a piece about that, and it got a lot of attention. We got on radio, and I was on the radio with Decatur, WZUS. And there, we prepared before we got on the radio, and we found out. And I couldn't believe these numbers. It was unreal. Black third grade in Decatur Public Schools. There's 8,000 kids in the Decatur Public Schools. Black third grade reading meets or exceeds proficiency, 2%. And I was like, that has to be an accident, right? It has to be wrong. It can't be true. We flipped over to the math numbers, 1%. And I said, well, that can't be right either. So we called the school, and the school says, yeah, we're not challenging those. So I went down, a couple weeks later, I went down to visit the school, and there was no plan. There was no plan, but I will tell you two things I've heard. Of course, you hear the obvious, we need more money. They said that they're going to implement more diversity and equity and things like that. And they said they needed more black teachers. And that was the only, well, they said they wanted to do more curriculum, to be fair. They said that too. But, you know, so I've been struck by that, and we're going to write it up and bring attention to it, but it's sad because I don't think anybody cares. And so when I was reading your book, I saw the one line that really caught my attention. And it said, you know, white university administrations have added and abetted the destruction of the black mind. They've done so not by defending they have done so by not defending the values of America and Western civilization. Just take us through a little bit of I know your critiques of the universities and education.
Right, well, it's not just, unfortunately, it's not just blacks, it's also poor whites, it's poor Hispanics, it's people who fall below a certain income level, which by default disqualifies them from accessing a superior form of education. But I must say that I am very, very appalled at the increasing attacks on Western civilization, the increasing attacks on American civilization, the increasing attack on the scientific method, on reason, on logic, on categorizing all of these phenomena as a construct of white racist European males. And I trace, in the book, I trace it back to what I call the revolutionary studies, or the victim studies of the 1960s, when we had queer studies, women's, you can't even call it women's studies, they call it with a Y, women's studies, and post-colonial studies, and Chicana studies, and black studies, and gender studies, all kinds of hyphenated studies that were forms of reparations, I argue, by the way, because it brought these people within the sovereign, into the sovereign mass. But these were activist programs. These were advocacy programs that were meant to radically question the legitimacy, the efficacy, and the appropriateness of Western civilization. In other words, at their heart, they had as their focus the sole motive of what they call decolonizing the black or any other minority mind from Western civilization. And we've been on a downward spiral since then, because when we look at what's happening today, when we look at wokeism, woke supremacy, when we look at the cancel culture, when we look at the idea that reason and logic, and now math is even racist. Did you know that? Yeah, math is now racist. Science is racist. You used to think that the hard sciences were inoculated against these kinds of accusations. But when the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 can be taught in a racist way, we really are at the lowest rungs of Dante's Inferno's hell. There's no lower place to sink in terms of intellectual obscenity, and I think this all started. It started with critical theory, which I won't get into, but really in terms of tangibly, where can you ostensibly point to where the universities began this process of what they call decolonizing the minds of people from the imperialistic, racist Western mind, of which we're all the beneficiaries, whether we're black, white, Polish, Caribbean, African. Every one of us in this room are beneficiaries and legatees of this amazing Western civilization. I trace it really back to these activist revolutionary studies programs in the 1960s that began the process of also, Martin Luther King would have rolled in his grave, resegregating college campuses where, I talk about in the book, where blacks demanded their own dormitories, demanded their own libraries, demanded their own spaces on the quad, you name it, resegregating the country in a way that the civil rights movement was completely against. And that's just a teaser.
All right, so things look pretty tough, right? And yet, you end your book on a hopeful note, as you mentioned. And and part of that, I think you can wrap some of that into your love for the country. You've mentioned that. And I think I love when people talk good about the country. It doesn't mean we're a perfect country. It doesn't mean we don't have problems, we don't have struggles. There's a lot of things we have to continue to fix. But there's a lack of respect and gratitude for what so many people before us have done to get here, including breaking down those problems that we had back in, of course, Civil War and then in 1964. So talk to us a little bit about why you're optimistic, why you think we can get out of this.
I'm optimistic because my first love, once I landed in this country, was the American people. I've had the good privilege since then of visiting about 55 countries because of my work. So I've been all over Europe, all over Asia, South America. And the American people, so I've seen the other side, and I'm from Jamaica, and I've seen the Caribbean countries. The American people of all hues, of all races, of all ethnicities, are an unprecedented people. They are an amazing, and I've lived in Germany for a year. I've taught in Hungary for 6 months. So I've taught at European universities also, and I see what the European mindset is like. The American people are an unprecedented people. Those of you who are Americans and don't realize how exemplary and benevolent you are as a people need to start checking your conscience and giving yourself a pat on the shoulder. And I'm not saying this in a patronizing way. I'm saying this as someone who's lived here for 36 years and has seen the other side. Because the American people are a can-do people. They're not bitter, they're not cynical. They start over from scratch. They typically do not have a sense of entitlement. And above all, unlike the useless, putrefacted, stinking academics who are just welfare scholars, really, and who contribute nothing, absolutely nothing to human civilization, Americans are problem solvers. And we see this. We see it whether one agrees with it or not. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the bringing in of blacks and other people who were excluded from what I call the pantheon of the human community, or the domain of the ethical, being brought into this domain. Whether one agrees with it or not, whether one sees this as a step forward or a step forward. Certainly as a gay person, I see this as a step forward. The 2015 Marital Act, I would like one day to get married to someone of my choice. Americans are always striving to make things better. And they have, at the heart of the American conscience, is what I call a self-reflexivity clause. That is a capacity to stand back and reflect on the wrong that has been done and an answer to the question, how can I make it better? How can I make it right? Americans are always trying not to exclude people from the domain of the ethical, but to include more people into the pantheon of the human community. We're an immigrant country, and so I want to spend some time on this because I think Americans are an exceptional people, and I've been to a lot of countries, and I don't go there as a tourist. I spend months. I spent 4 months in Peru. I've spent months in Mexico, a year in Germany. When I visit countries, I spend a long time in these countries, and I get to know people. And I travel around the countryside of southern Hungary, for example, Poland, where I've been 3 times. Had the pleasure of being in Poland 3 times. Americans are just exceptional. They are not defeatists by nature. And so my optimism lies in the fact that this unprecedented civilization that we are privileged to be a part of, that I certainly feel gratitude that I was let in. I sort of won the lottery in a way. And I think America has benefited enormously from having me as a citizen and should be as equally grateful that I'm sitting here as I am grateful that you all have let me into your country. You should be as grateful that I am a productive citizen. But it's that spirit, right? That spirit of respect, reciprocity, knowing your own value. I know that I'm a value, and every American knows that he or she is a value with something to contribute, that I think gives me great optimism. The defeatist attitude, the Americans are not a people who ossify. There isn't a calcification of the heart in the American people. Their civilization was forged in the crucibles of violence, but as are all meaningful civilizations, by the way, that are lasting, including the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Every civilization has been forged in violence. So my optimism, Ted, and to everyone listening, lies with the American people. It doesn't lie with the nature of the Constitution, because if we take, I saw a poll recently put out by the Pew survey that 72% of the Z generation would like to abolish the Constitution and to do away with the First Amendment. But I think it's going to take the average, not these academics, these woke academics who are welfare scholars. I hope this makes it into some sort of print so that my colleagues can see it and be really pissed off at me, really, really pissed off that I'm saying that they're welfare scholars who contribute nothing to civilization. It's the people who clean up, the janitor on the street, the custodians in our buildings, the people who clean the skyscrapers, who scale those skyscrapers, right? The entrepreneurs, the small businessmen and women of this country. These are the people with common sense, and these are the people who will remedy and fix this country. It's the average American, not the high-credentialed, omitting present company. I have a sense of humor in case you haven't realized it. That's where my optimism lies, Ted, will save this civilization, because they have fought hard to keep it intact. And I'm confident. And we're seeing very, very signs of wokeism and cancel culture, the pushback of parents getting more involved in their children's education and saying, oh, wait a minute, we handed our children over to you in good faith, thinking that you would give them a robust and rigorous education. And now you are telling us, for example, that this is pure Stalinism, that your parents cannot gender you because we won't gender you in the classroom, presenting distrust and a bifurcation between parents and their children, and parents waking up and saying, this is intolerable, this is unacceptable. That is what gives me hope. It's a common sense attitude of the average American.
You're an educator, so I want to ask you this last question, and I think we should open it up to the crowd. My fear has been, I've got young kids, and they hear different things at school, but they certainly don't live the hardships around here that many other people have lived, or if you go back 50 years, like all you guys were working in farms or whatever, we're hard slaving away. I should use that term in this thing. Working hard. I'm worried that kids don't know difficulty, right? They just know success, they know technology, they have everything in their hands, and everything's easy. And so I was fortunate in 1998. I got to go to work in Warsaw, Poland for 9 years. And in Warsaw, when I got there, everybody was still wearing really gray, everything was still gray, everything was still dark. And then about whatever it was, 9 years since the wall had come down in Berlin. But I tell you, I loved being in Poland in those years, because it didn't matter if you were left or right. You valued, you treasured the fact that there was economic opportunity again. You valued that there were individual rights and freedom that they had missed out on for 50 years. And so the culture there, of course, because things are still fresh, they want freedom, they want economic growth and capitalism. And here, we're so far away from that. So as an educator, what do we need to do in our schools? And I know we need to get rid of a lot of stuff, but what is it, in you expressing the hope and the positive virtues of America, what is it we need to do to try to see if we can flip that somehow, at least at the margins, start getting something more positive going rather than the negative stuff we hear all the time?
Well, first we must start to undo the damage that has been inflicted on these young children, which is hatred of America, because it is hatred of the good for the good. Hatred of this great, unprecedented republic because it's good. We have to we have to engage in an unlearning process among these children. So what I've called, and we have overcome, cultivating a sense of patriotic love of country, not a sort of mindless flag-waving jingoism, but where you love your country because you know rationally, and you can see in reason, and you can see also empirically, the virtues, the values, the foundational principles, which you yourself, each and every one of us, is dependent upon. So we have to, I would say, reverse the ethos of Americophobia that exists in this country. It is much more fashionable for young people to say, I hate America, or I'm ashamed of being American. To each of us, I'm wearing my American flag because I'm proud to be an American and I love this great country. If each of us just simply uttered, no, this is not a perfect country, but it is a great unprecedented phenomenon in the history of human civilizations. And I love this great country, and I can tell you a story why I love this country. So we've got to first of all, so we've got to abolish the teachers' union. They're evil. And they get in the minds of they have a coercive monopoly on education, and they wreak havoc. But more practically, this is very philosophical what I'm saying about teaching patriotic love and love of country. I've gone as far as advocating abolishing the income tax, and I'm pretty radical on that. But I would say school choice, that's the obvious one, not taxing people on the lower income individuals on the income that they would use to send their children to a charter school or to a private school where they can get a proper education, where they can learn the values and the foundational principles on which their lives rest, instead of being ungrateful parasites, which is what we're teaching these young children to be, ungrateful mendicants, beggars, recipients of a welfare state, and then turning around, spitting in the face of the state and saying, I hate you. So it's a long journey, but, I was watching Coven with my partner recently, American Horror Story, and there's a great line that I've been using in my talks where Jessica Lange says to Angela Bassett, she says, we don't have to bother with worker bees anymore. What we have to do is we go after the hives. And that's what we have to do. We have to stop swatting these worker bees and go after the hives. And we know where the hives are. So we have to defund the universities. We have to defund the humanities and the social sciences that are preaching hatred, because those are the hives, those are the breeding grounds in which these intellectual terrorists reign supreme and wreak havoc and take hostage the minds of the young American minds. So defund universities, get rid of the teachers' union. What is that ghastly phenomenon? The national education? What is it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we must also, this is the final thing I'll say, we must also let people know that the procreative choices that you make in this world are your responsibility. They're not the responsibility of society, really. When you make a decision to have a child, that responsibility is yours, and you cannot pass that off gratuitously to society as a whole. Again, it fosters this kind of entitlement mentality. So when you have a child and you know that that child is your top value in the hierarchy of your values, you will do whatever it is that you can do to secure the foundational well-being of that child. And again, stops these little insignificant professors, assistant professors and associate professors, and Miss Jane or Mr. Jude in public school, K through, public school number 12. These are worker bees. We need to have to go to the hives. We need to write to our congressmen and our senators and tell them to withhold state funds. We need to also finally tell donors, alumni donors, and corporations that if you are giving money to universities, there need to be conditionals affixed to them. There must be intellectual diversity in the classroom. You cannot have these radical left-wing Marxists, communists, teaching their ideologies and then punishing rejoinders when they are issued by, let's say, conservative students. So there must be conditions affixed to any kind of funds or dollars that are allocated by alumni donors. And you will see, the money counts. You get people in their pocketbooks, and the changes will slowly come around.
Great. All right, so I think we'll open up to questions if that's okay. Is it, Mark, is that okay?
Yeah, I was gonna say I could walk around tonight.
Oh, fantastic.
Right?
Thank you very much for coming. I actually have a son who's a student. He's a junior at DePaul. And his freshman year, he pretty much encountered here's what whiteness is and why it's bad and why you need to sit down and shut up. And he's pretty much internalized that and been quiet ever since. We discuss this quite often. I try and encourage him to stand up for what he believes in and make a civil argument when there are sort of illiberal ideas being put forward. But he very much, I think, is smart enough to see that he's really outnumbered, including by the professors very often. And I'm sure you're stung quite a bit by the folks in that hive as well. So I guess my question is, what advice would you give to kids who are in the class who have resisted being enthralled by the illiberalism, and how can they stand up?
Thank you for that question, and I hope that I get to meet your son one day when I return to DePaul in person. I'm teaching online next semester. I think that, as I said before, I've seen professors failing or issuing lower grades to students who issue rejoinders to the positions that are orthodox or received wisdom. But professors are very cowardly. They hate confrontation. So there are two things I would say. Tell your son not to instigate any unprovoked confrontation between himself and the professor. But if he's being attacked because of something that he has no control over, the color of his skin, professors rely on the sanction of the victim. They rely on the silence of victims that they have persecuted. And the minute, I've seen this, I've been in class for 25 years, the minute a student stands up and says, "You're just wrong," I adduce myself as evidence of everything that is good in this world. I dare any professor, if your son stood up and said, "I adduce myself as evidence of everything that is noble and good and in this world. I'm a repository of all the values and the principles that my mother imbued me with, and you are calling that racist and evil, shame on you, professor," he will get either a small round of applause, probably the rest of the student body will be shocked, but his professor will be silenced because they're not expecting confrontation. What they're expecting is acquiescence. So tell him to stand up and do not be humble. Do not practice the vice of humility when he knows that he has rightful pride in his values and in his character. Announce them as virtues and dare his professor to condemn his humanity after he's made that proud declaration. I've done that, and it's never happened to me. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. It seems like a lot of the academic ethos that's producing all of this is an overreaction to what happened in Nazi Germany. They're very scared of fascism, and so they're trying to overreact with communism. And earlier you spoke about instilling national values, reaffirming the nation's good, but fascism was all about nationalism. And so there's a really big scare about not affirming your nation too much. How do you affirm the nation without losing people because of that?
I can't wait to answer this question. Yes, yes. Give me the mic, give me the mic. So, yes, this is a justified concern. I think there are two forms of nationalism. There is what we have in America, which is called civic nationalism, in which citizenship is not based on ethnicity, on lineage or blood or tribalism, but it's not just theoretically, but it's empirically open to all persons, so long as they pledge a thin allegiance to the Republic and the values of the Republic. And then there's something called ethnic or cultural nationalism that we saw in Nazi Germany, that we saw under Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, in which national identity is constitutively based on excluding others based on their race and ethnicity. We are an inclusive nation. We don't care whether you come from Nigeria, we don't care whether you come from Cambodia, we don't care whether you come from Croatia. Citizenship is open to all persons, and that's civic nationalism. That kind of nationalism is not exclusionary. That kind of nationalism does not depend on the demonization of other people for you to have your identity. For you to have your identity as an American, I've lived there for 36 years, and I think the country, in all honesty, has gotten a little bit more anti-immigrant in the past couple of years for reasons that we could talk about. But for the most part, your American identity is not predicated on the demonization of another person in the way that if you were a Serbian under Slobodan Milosevic, or if you were German under Nazi Hitler, a constitutive part of your identity as a German or as a Serbian rested on demonizing the Croatians or the Kosovo people, the people from the ethnic Albanians. And I don't think that this kind of nationalism is something that we have, at least not yet, in the United States of America. So it's a kind of proud nationalism where what you're proud of are the following: the foundational principles, the first principles that undergird your American civilization, that give you the freedom to say to the other person, this is one of the things I love about this country, I disagree 100% with what you're saying, but I will fight to the death for you to say it. And then for you to give me the right to convince you that you're wrong, and then to give you also the right to convince me that I'm wrong and convincing you that you're wrong. That's the beauty of this country. And that's the kind of nationalism, national identity that we should be supporting, not by demonizing other people, not by excluding other people arbitrarily based on race or ethnicity, but by a proud upholding of the values and the principles that give us our identity as Americans. I feel as thoroughly American, although I will never get rid of my accent because I came here a little bit too late. And besides, I like it, so I don't want to give it up. It's one of the few things I hold on tenaciously is my accent. There are lots of things I've given up and become very American. But the point I'm trying to make is I feel as American as any one of you who are born here in this country after living here for 36 years, despite the fact that I have a different racial ascriptive identity or a different ethnicity or nationality. And I've never felt excluded so far because of those attributes. And that's a kind of nationalism that's very different from an ethnic nationalism that would seek to say, you cannot come to the country because you're from Jamaica.
Hi, so you had mentioned something that I really resonated with, which is when you were discussing how experience in countries other than the United States has it kind of give you a perspective that allows you to appreciate kind of benefits of existing in American society and around the American people. And in my own personal experience, I had lived abroad for about 10 years, and I went abroad, as somebody who was very much like what you were describing, who fashionably hated America. And I came back 10 years later, a bigger patriot than anybody else I knew. What that led me to think is that, if in a perfect world, if we could just get everybody to spend a year in a culture that's very different from their own and then come back, that would be a wonderful thing. But are there ways of shortcutting that? Like how can you kind of get that perspective into people's heads without actually causing them to, travel abroad? How can you kind of get people to really appreciate what they've got here?
The first answer I would give to your question is to teach history objectively. There's a great book called How Capitalism Saved America, from the Pilgrims to the 21st century. That is, and let me say something also, that I have seen people who have traveled the world, and having traveled the world, they return not with a renewed sense of appreciation for America. They have a kind of superiority, a kind of parochialism that is forged in the crucibles of, I myself am superior. I've seen this in Paris, but these dumb Americans in their sneakers and their loud talking, they're vulgar. And so I don't know necessarily that Americans who travel come back all with an appreciation of this country, because I've seen quite the reverse, and I'm very protective when I go abroad, and Americans are loud, and that's good. There's vitality, We're an exuberant people. I'm saying we, because I'm an American too. We're exuberant, vitalistic people, right? We don't speak in hushed whispers, and we manifest our exuberance. But I've seen where people come back and sort of lambast Americans. But to get to the second part of your question, I do think that it takes, in some sense, really, really educating the young people about how unprecedented this republic is. They need to learn history. They need to learn about other civilizations. They need to learn the fact that the political milieu of America, a constitutional republic that guarantees, not creates, but discovers the inalienability of rights that originate from God, in my view at least. Or if you're an atheist, from your nature. That a political environment that matches the requirements of human survival, which is freedom, is an unprecedented phenomenon. America is the first civilization to match man's human nature with a political environment that corresponds directly to the requirements of that nature, which are liberty and freedom. And they need to be shown, to be gotten over their political correctness, to show that America is not the political equal of countries like Saudi Arabia, like North Korea, like Iran, like a lot of other countries that keep people outside the domain of the human community rather than bringing them in, which is what America has been doing since its inception in 1776. It's been a terrible, tragic, uneven, bumpy road where we've had to fasten our seatbelts and tighten them, but we're getting there. So teaching history objectively and not in this kind of horrible revisionist fashion that they're being taught is, I think, the first step. There is something called objectively teaching history. I believe that fervently. And when they understand that the country they live in is an unprecedented phenomenon, it is a phenomenon against the backdrop of other civilizations that have tried to foster a political environment that corresponds to the requirements of human nature and have failed miserably. And we see the results all around us. Why do we erect walls to keep people out when other countries erect walls, like Cuba, to keep people inside? If America were this evil, horrible, imperialistic, racist country, why are Haitians right now dying in boats as we speak, some of them drowning, Cubans struggling to get Africans Mexicans, people from Honduras, struggling to get into this horrible, pernicious, nefarious country. They need to learn the objective truths about what makes America exceptional in an unapologetic manner.
So thank you so much for your leadership. I think it's very rare and that it should be honored, so thank you. As we look at higher education today, I occasionally get pretty hopeless about, how do we actually change the culture? How do you get inside of each classroom? How do you change the way people teach? Can you talk a little bit about how that might change, what future models exist, what's coming together, maybe specifically about things that are happening in Austin, Texas, you might be able to refer to?
Right. Well, I'm a little bit of an old-fashioned scholar in the sense that unless my students Google me, they have no idea what my political leanings or orientations are. I'm an orthodox teacher that conducts very close readings of the text, tries to be the best spokesperson. When I teach Plato, they think I don't like Plato, by the way, but I respect him as one of the greatest philosophers, the first philosopher. They think I'm a Platonist. When I teach Marx, they think I'm a Marxist, and I'm most emphatically not. So to lead into an answer to your question, places like the University of Austin, which is an up-and-coming new university, places like Ralston College, like Hillsdale, that believe in the idea that there is an objective reality, that there are objective facts, that there is something called reason and logic. There are phenomena called reason and logic that can adjudicate among truth claims and arrive at truth. So the first thing is that we have to dispel this notion that there is no such thing as truth, because there is. And our children are walking around thinking that as I said to one of my obstreperous children, who insisted on telling me that men can have babies, I said to that student, please stop trying to elevate your sophomoric high school opinions to the level of human knowledge and your personal angst to the level of metaphysical speculation. Because there are facts. So facts and truth and logic and reason and rigor, and the idea that through a long protracted process or processes of claims, counterfactuals, rejoinders, we can arrive at something like truth. There's a nasty idea pathogen that is infecting this country, and it's called moral relativism, which is the idea that there are no objective truths, and that there are no objective criteria for adjudicating among truth claims, and that each culture is the author of its own truths. Well, I say poof, malarkey. That's a bunch of crap. And we need to teach students that there is something called truth, that we might dispute among the truth, but there is truth. And we have to spend our entire life struggling to get at the truth, whatever the truth claim is that we're trying to get at, whether it's algebra, logic, philosophy, arithmetic, chemistry, the chemical tables, you name it, history, there's something called truth. It's a very, very hard battle, because what we've done is we have sort of, beginning in the 1980s with the self-esteem movement, we have elevated people's feelings to the level of a cult, where people think that I feel this way, and if you offend my feelings, you eviscerate me of my dignity. And people are petrified of other people's opinions, where we know criminalize opinions. And it began with the idea that every single utterance that came out of a 5-year-old's mouth, every single scribble that he made on a paper was the equal of a Picasso or a Matisse, when it's nothing but the scribblings of your 5-year-old child. Pin it on your refrigerator if you want, but don't tell him that he's a genius when he's nothing but a developing Right now, he's a mediocre human being, and you're developing him into something great. And he will aspire to greatness one day. But this is what we're fighting against, the notion that any kind of feeling, any kind of utterance that comes out of the mouth of every single village idiot is the moral and scientific equivalent of an Einstein. That's what we have to fight against. And that's what I think these new alternative educational models are hell-bent on fighting against.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I enjoyed both of your books. I was actually going to ask, because kind of piggybacking on what you were saying earlier, is my kids are actually mixed race. They're black, like their dad actually is from Barbados. And they're much younger. They're 5 and 7, but I'm very worried about like CRT and how it's going to give kids kind of like an inferiority complex or just a complex in general. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were, or how you would say to kind of inoculate against that whole ideology getting into our minds.
Well, collectivism has to be defeated. This whole notion of CRT, this whole notion of ascriptive racial identity, first of all, is nothing but biological collectivism. So you need to teach them the virtues of individualism. What Martin Luther King, what the great writer Shelby Steele in his book, The Content of Our Character, espoused, that you are judged first and foremost not by an accidental attribute, which is, by the way, morally insignificant. The color of your skin, the texture of your hair, all give me no clues or signs into the inner domain of your moral consciousness. Each person has to be judged as an individual, and as an individual exclusively based on his or her, not they, his or her actions and performances. And that is the greatest inoculant, because no matter, I remember walking in Lincoln Park where I used to live. I live in Lakeview now, and there were these two white guys in a pickup truck with a Confederate flag, and I kind of wondered, what the hell is that doing in Illinois? I mean, I spent 5 years in Indiana where I could see this, and they said to me, "Nigger, go back to the South Side where you belong." And my response, I was lucky I didn't get shot. I just started laughing uproariously because I thought, my dad's schizophrenic. So I grew up, craziness is very close to me. So I said, he's a benign psychotic. These are malignant psychotics. But I laughed because I thought, that's psychosis right there in the person, in the flesh and blood. Racism is nothing more than manifested psychosis, misperceiving reality and according a judgment based on attributes which in and of themselves have no clue as to a person's moral character. And so there's a way in which I couldn't be harmed. I could be harmed physically, but the statement left me amused because I thought that's what racism really is. It's psychosis. It's a kind of craziness. And you see this in the CRT. In reverse, you see this with CRT. The old school racists, we could spot, but you see how the CRT advocates are just as kooky and psychotic in what they're advocating. So I'd say if you tell your child, you teach the virtue of individualism, you teach the virtue of character building, that is going to be the greatest inoculant against all of these idea pathogens that are going to come hurtling towards them.
So earlier you talked about your opinion on the income tax. So my question is, how do you feel about the negative income tax as opposed to welfare?
Repeat the question, sorry. How do I distinguish?
How do you feel about the negative income tax system suggested by people like Milton Friedman as opposed to our current welfare system?
So again, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned capitalist here in that I'm going to say that the proper functions of the government are strictly limited. That is, the proper function of the government is a negative one. It is to safeguard your individual rights against encroachment of others. So, military to keep us protected from outside attacks, law courts to uphold contracts, and law enforcement to enforce the law to protect our individual rights. So in some sense, we do need taxes because we need an dispassionate, unprejudiced phenomenon that has a coercive use on force, which is the government, to protect our rights as individuals. But I'm not sure that the income tax necessarily, look, the state of Tennessee and Texas and all these other states that don't have an income, Florida, I think, that doesn't have an income tax, are thriving quite well. So if this were unilaterally applied and the proper functions of the government were adhered to, not the sort of expansive, rapacious government that we have, big government which encroaches on every single sphere of a person's life, from funding abortion clinics to funding gender reassignment surgeries to just imagine every sphere of human life where the government has some kind of been drinking too much wine. Has some kind of a right to interfere, let's just say a right of interference. That's how I hope I'm answering your question. That is, I think that the level of taxation is commensurate with the level of the growth of government in our lives. The more government encroaches into spheres of our lives that are properly our responsibility, the more vast taxation is going to have to increase.
Hey, thank you, Jason. So my question is, when we're talking about like some of the language you were using in terms of this is a hive and the teachers use evil and whatnot, I understand that totally. But like when we were just talking about capitalism, and it seems like, for example, one of the reasons we're in this mess that we find ourselves in is we have big tech, who basically has a monopoly on the algorithms and censors things. And I think I saw a video from Ray Dalio maybe a week ago or so, that basically said he's willing to play by China's authoritarian rules because he's a businessman, that's just how things have to go. So my question is, you know, when we're talking about these issues, again, and I know people who are of the most malignant, narcissistic type of people who inspire that kind of rage, but when we say like, you know, people who believe in socialism or something like that are evil, it seems to me they're misguided more than they are evil, and that when we have like legitimate problems, I think we all agree, like big tech censorship is a legitimate problem, and I think that's in part due to, you know, you can call it capitalism, but I think that's vague. But it seems like, do you think there's much more room for empathy in terms of these people who believe these things are misguided rather than they are malignant or say? And I think there definitely are those malignant narcissists at the top, but when we use the kind of language that's very divisive and very abrasive, I think it makes it more difficult to then get to that common consensus that 95% of people agree. We don't have to be pure capitalists, we don't have to be pure socialists, but I'm just curious as to what you think about that.
Thank you for the question. So there are two immediate responses that I have, and there's a twofold response I have for you. Going back to American Horror Stories and Coven, where Jessica Lange says to her daughter, who's married a witch slayer, she says, "You are not just blind, you are willfully blind. You brought a viper into this house," right? So I think there are people who are just willfully blind. There are people who call themselves socialists and communists who are ignorant. They don't know the facts. They want to be on the right side of history. And if you teach them the facts, they're receptive. And then there are people who are just willfully blind. They don't want to know the facts. They're averse to facts. They're averse to anything that will disrupt received orthodoxy or received wisdom. But I agree with you from one respect. I think strategically, it doesn't make sense to call these people evil. If what you're trying to do is to win cohorts to your side. Better, and this is a very American virtue, better to grant people the benefit of the doubt and to say they just don't know the facts. As a teacher in the classroom, I cannot adopt that. In my public life, like speaking here, I sound a little bit more cocky than I'm in a classroom. I'm very soft-spoken, I'm very gentle with my students because I assume that they just don't know the facts. And then I tell them the facts, and then they still hold erroneous opinions, and I use logic, I use empirical evidence to say, okay guys, you need to reconsider this. And I think strategically you're right. It does require a degree of patience, but then I'm of two minds because I think we're in a war. We're in a culture war. And it's not my place the classroom is not the place to fight a culture war. I'm against that kind of activism in the classroom. But I'm also an intellectual activist. I'm a public intellectual. And in a culture war, I'm going to take sides. And if I think that you are willfully blind, after I've presented facts after facts after facts to you and showed you that Venezuela, which is rich in resources, but because of something stupid called socialism, people are eating out of garbage pans right now, you still refuse, then that willful blindness is manifested in behavior that results in the direct affliction of harm, unprovoked harm on people, and that's a definition of evil.
So because of time right now, Jason, if you have a copy of his book, Jason's gonna sign your copy of your book, because of time right now. We end here at 10 o'clock. And we are so lucky. Thank you to Jason and Ted for coming tonight to do this. We could do this for hours. And thanks for everybody for showing up. Thank you.